Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation. The following is a co-production of KQED and the Center for Investigative Reporting.
Tonight, how safe are our kids if an earthquake strikes while they're at school? Are California's children on shaky ground? Good evening, I'm Scott Shafer. Welcome to On Shaky Ground. Tonight, a 19-month investigation by the Center for Investigative Reporting's California Watch finds the state is failing to enforce earthquake safety standards in California's public schools. It uncovers faulty construction as well as a disturbing lack of oversight by those in charge of keeping our children safe. In a few minutes, we'll speak with our guests. Correspondent Anna Warner with the Center for Investigative Reporting begins our story in a small Northern California community.
2 miles from the sea along the coast sits the town of Pescadero, population 2,042. It's where Brian Burns lives and works on his family's ranch.
Our family's been in Pescadero roughly about 116 years.
The town built its middle and high schools on property his family used to own.
I knew that the earthquake fault went through the property. I didn't know exactly where.
So Burns started asking questions about the safety of those school buildings.
What did you find out about your schools?
That most of the buildings are uncertified. Most construction has been illegally done.
Illegal under a state law known as the Field Act, which says all school construction projects must be certified as earthquake resistant. The law was put into place after the devastating 1933 Long Beach earthquake. 70 schools collapsed and 120 people died. And when Burns and fellow resident Jeff Gananian looked further, they found structural work was done on their school without the state's approval.
That's when the light bulb went on. And we began to realize that there are potentially thousands and thousands of other projects.
People won't find out until a disaster happens or an earthquake happens. And at that point, it's too late. I don't want to see kids get killed.
And the risks are statewide. A California Watch investigation finds thousands of school projects don't comply with the Field Act. And those schools aren't just in small districts like Pescadero. The Los Angeles Unified School District finished this new middle school just 6 years ago. Yet state records indicate that huge window walls, 3 stories high, may not be properly anchored. Even the original architect on that project, Jim Smith, says those windows, as constructed, could pose a risk to students in an earthquake.
The whole window wall could come out or glass shattering, and obviously if that happens, it's not a good situation.
And what would your concern be?
They could be injured.
The state agency charged with enforcing school earthquake regulations is the Division of the State Architect, or DSA. When California Watch brought its questions there,
I'm going to tell you there is no evidence that children are in unsafe buildings.
Scott Harvey is acting director of the Department of General Services, which oversees that division. He says California Watch's investigation did uncover problems, but mainly with incomplete files.
Can we do a better job of that? Absolutely. Should we streamline that? Absolutely.
But Harvey insists.
I don't think those files have led to any safety violations. I don't think we have ever put a child at risk. In fact, the Field Act ensures that California kids are in the safest buildings nationally.
But a California Watch review of the DSA's own records suggests the problems are more serious. This 2006 report concluded that some school projects were being completed without adequate testing and inspection, sometimes with dangerous construction flaws.
What that tells me is that we're building schools in California that are not properly designed and checked in the field to make sure they're properly built. That's a problem.
Peter Yanev is an earthquake engineer and consultant.
That obviously the system is not doing what it's supposed to do.
And it's not just the thousands of uncertified school projects. California has another major problem: old schools that were constructed before stricter building codes took effect in 1978. Senator Ellen Corbett, a longtime earthquake safety advocate, commissioned a study to identify those schools over a decade ago.
There wasn't statewide information about where the needs were.
Corbett's study produced this list, more than 7,500 school buildings statewide considered most at risk. One of them, Philadelphia Elementary in Pomona. District Administrator Scott Stark.
We've got schools that are old and that have been, deteriorating over the years.
State evaluators said 4 of Philadelphia's 7 buildings are likely not to perform well in an earthquake, but the school hasn't received any state funds to fix them.
We didn't qualify for funding or what was considered by those standards that DSA put out as a seismically vulnerable critical site.
In fact, an analysis by California Watch shows just 38 of the 7,500 most vulnerable school buildings even qualified for funding. Why? To be eligible, a district had to show that an earthquake would subject a school to an intense level of ground shaking, or what's called G-forces of 1.7 Gs.
These are very, very large earthquake forces.
That's a requirement some experts say exceeds ground shaking during the 1994 Northridge earthquake, a requirement Yanev says doesn't take all risks into consideration.
In fact, some schools that are in lower earthquake areas undoubtedly are higher hazard because they're older, not built as well, built to all the criteria, etc.
Undoubtedly are higher hazard.
Absolutely, higher hazard.
So they have left some schools essentially out of the equation.
I would expect that to be the case, yes.
In fact, documents reveal the DSA's own structural engineers recommended using a lower ground shaking number of 1.35 Gs. So what led the state to set the number so much higher? Liability. Documents show state officials worried that with a lower number, too many schools would be classified as vulnerable and yet sit unaddressed.
You've suddenly created a unfunded liability for which somebody has got to be responsible.
So to avoid that, documents show state officials simply raised the number to 1.7 Gs to limit the number of schools eligible, despite knowing some at-risk school buildings would not qualify. And Harvey's explanation for raising the number?
The rationale was to ensure that we were taking care of the worst, starting at a point where we would not exhaust the dollars available.
So what about the schools left potentially at risk that were shut out of funding?
Does that mean that those schools would not be equally vulnerable?
No, it does not mean that.
Did they know that?
You'll have to ask them.
So we asked Pomona's Scott Stark.
That's okay. Yeah, very interesting. There was nothing in the guideline that came down to us that said, oh, by the way, this was based on the fact that we've only got so much money, and so we're trying to exclude school. If assuming what you're telling me is true, we had no knowledge of that.
It's something the legislation's sponsor didn't know either.
Hearing that information is very shocking. It sounds like they weren't doing the best they could have been doing for our children. And that should never be the case here, ever.
In the end, just 2 schools got that state funding, which leads to the real question. Are California schools safe for children when that next big earthquake comes? There, even Acting Director Harvey admits,
I don't really know. I'm hopeful that we have done the best we can to ensure that kids are safe in their schools.
Back in Pescadero, that's not a comforting answer.
They just don't know. They honestly don't know. And that's the scariest thing.
Joining me now are seismologist Mary Lou Zobak, Bill Savage, engineering officer with the West Contra Costa Unified School District, and State Senator Ellen Corbett. Mary Lou Zobak, let me begin with you as a seismologist and a geologist. There were a lot of issues raised in this piece. What troubles you most?
Well, California's earthquake country. We've identified 7,500 buildings that are seismically vulnerable, and we're not doing anything about it. And the criteria that have been established is very restrictive. It's real, and rightly so. We want to address the worst schools first, but there have to be close to identified faults. In the last 40 years, every large earthquake in California has occurred off those main faults.
Is it that they've used the wrong criteria, or that they've sort of made the criteria too narrow?
I think the criteria is too narrow and restrictive right now. And also, it doesn't take into account the local site conditions. Ground shaking can be greatly amplified on soft soil. We saw that in the marina in 1989.
Bill Savage, you oversee construction of schools in your school district, and you have a number of schools close to the Hayward fault line where many experts think the next big one is going to happen. What do you think of this? Is this the view that you have on the ground of dealing with the state?
Well, our district has been at the forefront of taking action in a positive way because we have support of our voters for local bond measures. And what we've done is we have engaged in a really strong program of seismic evaluations for all of our schools. We've identified poor performers. We had 14 different schools that were on the list that Senator Corbett was so important, helped to create. And we have gone through and we've demolished poor performing schools and built new ones. We've done seismic retrofits. What we haven't gotten is a lot of support from the state of California.
What kind of support?
And what we're looking for is funding support, frankly. And I will say that we are now the third school district to receive funds. We just got an allocation in March. And we're looking for additional support from the state to help us continue to address the schools. We have many schools along the Hayward Fault.
But when you say the state, there is some money that voters approved, a pot of money, $200 million, that you're drawing from. This is not the general fund where they're arguing about now in Sacramento. So why do the money's there, isn't it?
The criteria to access the money is way too restrictive. It doesn't allow districts that have schools that are you have to be right next to the fault to get the very high ground motion acceleration to qualify. You can only have certain types of building construction that qualify, and you have to show a high probability of collapse. There are a lot of other fundamental issues here. Non-structural seismic hazards, geotechnical issues if you're on landslide areas or in liquefaction areas that Mary Lou mentioned also. These things are not taken into account, and they're real problems for school districts.
Senator Corbett, you chair a state Senate committee on earthquake preparedness. How prepared are schools? It sounds like the state officials are saying we don't know.
Well, it's very interesting that when I first came to the legislature 12, 13 years ago, and I wanted to do legislation to find funding for schools, I found that there was no information available so I could prove my case. So I could make the case, these are the number of buildings that we need, here's the problem. So are we safe? I think that there are a lot of wonderful people, well-meaning people that make sure our kids are as safe as they can be. And there are school districts that have gone way beyond what they should have had to in passing their own local bonds. They've found the funding to do seismic retrofit, but we still have many older school buildings that could and should be seismically retrofit.
Bill Savage, what is your experience dealing with the state? Because they're saying that in many cases this is sloppy paperwork, that the local districts haven't given the state the proper documentation so that they can certify that these schools are safe. What's your take on that?
Well, my take, first of all, Scott, you have to remember, California has the highest building code standards of any of the states in the nation. And our schools are designed to the highest standards. They're built in accordance with DSA, Division of State Architect, approved plans and specs. They're inspected on a continuous basis. And when they're done, they're certified to the district by the architect and engineers of record, the inspector, and the contractor that they're built in accordance with the plans. The schools are safe.
You can say that throughout the state?
Our schools are safe. I can say that for the schools in West Contra Costa Unified School District, and I know for many, many school districts in the state. What we have is a documentation and paperwork issue where the bulk of the certifications exist in the school district's files and are not being transferred and appropriately documented by the state. We have, the Division of State Architect is highly impacted by our financial crisis, staffing levels, and they also are an organization that unfortunately is really set up for early 20th century work, and they're operating in the 21st century. There's not enough technology there to make this happen.
Mary Lou Zobak, in a perfect world, these decisions would be made based on engineering and seismology, tectonic plates,
Right.
but there's politics involved.
Right.
So is it possible to separate these things out? How important is it to just make these decisions based on the engineering, on the science of it? You can't really do that, can you?
Well, it's frustrating that it's wonderful that a sum of money was set aside for school retrofitting, $200 million. What's distressing is that the amount of money determined the ground shaking level that they would look at, rather than saying what's the ground shaking level we should be concerned about. And I think
what level of safety can we afford?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the really important thing, though, is this information is now out and available. California Watch has made it available so parents can go look and see if their school falls in one of these areas.
Senator Corbett, you're very aware of the state's financial problems.
Oh, yes.
Is that a legitimate reason to sort of narrow the criteria of which schools are eligible for the money, do you think?
Well, I was shocked when I heard that the criteria had been narrowed. And it's very interesting looking at it retrospectively. I had school districts come to me and say, can you do something with some legislation to change these standards, because we're just not quite there. We have these projects, they're ready to go, and now we find out that these changes have been made. I don't think that that was appropriate. I think that, to say that, we've done enough, it doesn't really accurately reflect how much more we need to do.
Well, and there is another troubling aspect of this story involving the inspectors hired to be the watchdogs on school construction projects. Once again, here's Anna Werner.
There are thousands of school construction projects throughout California and a network of more than 1,500 inspectors specially trained by the Division of the State Architect, or DSA, to oversee them. People like David Breedy.
You're making sure that the contractor and project management is performing the job and doing the job per the approved plans of DSA.
Breedy says inspectors are there in part to keep the contractors honest.
Contractors will try to use a substitute product or a lesser product.
You're saying that sometimes contractors might try to cut corners.
I'm saying 90% of the time the contractor is trying to cut corners.
Inspectors are supposed to be the watchdogs of school construction projects, tested and licensed by the state. But is the state always doing its job? Take the case of Richard Vail.
We couldn't trust anything that he did or said.
Inspector Doug Devine looked at projects inspected by Vail in Los Angeles.
In my opinion, Mr. Vail shouldn't be allowed to be out there and involved in anything, given his history.
Devine became familiar with Vail during an investigation into a city earthquake retrofit program for brick buildings. A key ingredient of that program? The installation of seismic anchors, metal rods like this one that tie roofs and floors to walls to keep buildings together.
If they don't do this correctly, what are the consequences?
Death and destruction.
But in over 24 projects, Devine found these makeshift seismic anchors. When the city tested those anchors, they failed. So who had approved them?
It was only the Deputy Inspector Richard Vail who was allowing these anchors to be put in.
The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office charged Vail with filing false reports, and in 1997, Vail pled no contest to conspiracy to obstruct justice, a felony.
I didn't want him out there ever inspecting anything in our city again.
Yet despite his conviction, the DSA allowed Vail to obtain a state inspection license, and sources and documents show as recently as last year, he worked on major school construction projects.
I couldn't believe it. A felony conviction is no simple matter, it's no little thing. And when you're looking at the protection of our children, that's unbelievable.
We asked Acting DSA Director Chip Smith how the agency could certify someone like Vail.
Well, I'm not sure I'm simply not sure of the details of this particular case.
Is it a problem that a guy with a felony conviction associated with faulty seismic work gets approved to work and certify school projects?
If that were indeed the case, I would have a problem with that myself.
It turns out the agency doesn't do any criminal background checks.
Our program, our process, our supporting regulations don't address that. I'm not saying it's not a good idea to look at that.
Not only that, in a review of the last 3 decades, California Watch found nearly 300 school inspectors with documented problems, ranging from absenteeism to failing to identify construction defects. So could the DSA do a better job of oversight?
I think it could be improved. It would be beneficial. Do I think it's an alarmist problem right now at this moment? No. I don't.
But this former state legislator says,
I don't agree that it's just a room for improvement situation. This is a bill that seeks to...
While in the state assembly, Sally Lieber found problems in the state's inspections for school buildings.
It's not a system where the public's interest is protected.
Lieber says because inspectors are actually hired by the districts, they may face pressure to look the other way on projects to stay employed.
All of the incentives are there to cut corners. The status quo gives the contractors and the local districts all the flexibility of the fox guarding the hen house.
And correspondent Anna Warner joins us now. And Anna, first a quick comment, if you would. Did you hear from the inspector, Richard Vail, who you identified as having been convicted of a felony and was still on the job?
California Watch did contact Mr. Vail, and his response was he declined an interview, but said that he felt that this was sort of an attempt to smear him, that this had all been in the past, and that everybody had moved on from this years ago.
In the course of reporting these stories, did anybody on the inside, from the state, from the school districts, from the Department of Education, anywhere, say to you, you've got to really look at this, this is a problem? Because we hear a lot of excuses being made, a lot of fingers being pointed as well toward the others, but who took responsibility?
Well, as you know, California Watch has a team of reporters working on this project. So, for example, Maine reporter Corey Johnson, he was hearing from people inside DSA, either current or former DSA officials, who were saying, look, there are problems, but politically, we can't get them out there. We can't talk publicly about them.
What does that mean?
That they felt like they wanted to talk about the fact that the bureaucracy in many ways was getting in the way of safety, but they couldn't come out and publicly talk about it themselves, and they really wanted the information to get out. Reporter Erica Perez, who worked on the inspector's story, was hearing from inspectors on the inside of the system, and who were saying that, you know, we are seeing the problems in construction. We're seeing problems at with the state monitoring. The state's engineers who are supposed to be monitoring the inspectors, they're nowhere around. And then when we traveled around interviewing people, we were hearing from a lot of different people, including parents and teachers, who would say, you know, I'm confused about why my school got a roof improvement project, yet I find out later it's never been certified. How can that happen?
Yeah. Bill Savage, this question of hiring inspectors, we heard in Anna's piece some of the problems associated with that at the local level. How do you ensure that the inspectors are good?
Well, the best way you do that, Scott, is you go through an interview process and you check references. It's a best practice for anyone in business to do that. Just we're in the business of building schools and building them safely. And the system, you know, on a big school construction site, we have inspection teams that include not just one, but sometimes two inspectors full-time. And we bring in testing and material labs inspectors. We have visits every month by the DSA field engineer coming to the site. The system can work. It needs some areas of improvement, and we need to make sure we weed out the people that are not doing the job. But one thing we could do is we could do a better job certifying the inspectors, maybe giving them better professional development and training. Many of them come into the field from the field, literally, as former contractors.
Senator Corbett, if you or I break the law, we're going to be prosecuted and punished, probably. In a case like this where a bureaucracy, the division of the state architect, isn't doing its job or it's ignoring the Field Act, who's responsible? How do you hold them accountable?
Well, the best way to do it is make sure you have very strict oversight. And the Select Committee on Earthquake Safety and Preparedness is going to be asking a lot of questions about what's been uncovered on this investigation. These things just shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have inspectors that aren't doing the work and aren't keeping our children safe. It's just not acceptable.
Mary Lou Zobak, is it possible that, as the state says, we don't know that these schools are unsafe, but that they may be safe, that maybe this isn't as big a problem just because we don't have the certification that they're safe? Maybe it's not a problem.
Well, certainly the schools have been built supposedly to very high standards, but the lack of verification is a problem. How are we certain? But I think the bigger problem is we've identified 7,500 buildings that are a problem throughout the state.
But reality is that although there's been $200 million set aside, that would cost about $5 billion, right, to get it done. So
Well, the initial estimates that came out, but they just did a survey of the 9 school districts that had the most vulnerable buildings or the most vulnerable locations. And the estimates for the retrofits were about 1/5 of what the state had estimated.
Bill Savage, what would make this system work better?
Well, Scott, I think that let's go back to what Mary Lou was talking about in the seismic safety issue. We need to have a common sense approach. We need to find ways that we can use criteria that are a little bit less restrictive to get the money out to schools to help them do seismic upgrades on schools that may not be the most vulnerable sitting on the line. I think we've addressed a lot of those schools over time, but let's look at ways that we can get more money available that's sitting there unfunded right now.
So it's not a hopeless situation.
No, it's not.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for being here tonight. You can go to kqed.org/onshakyground for more, including interactive maps, searchable databases, and other resources. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Scott Shafer. Good night.